Across pre-colonial Africa, relationships between men occurred within a wide variety of social, cultural, and economic contexts. These relationships ranged from formalized unions to intimate companionships, mentorship bonds, spiritual pairings, and domestic partnerships. While colonial narratives often portrayed these relationships through moralistic or criminalizing frameworks, pre-colonial African societies interpreted them through systems rooted in lineage, age, spirituality, and local customs. As a result, male same-sex intimacy existed within recognizable cultural frameworks long before European influence reshaped the continent's legal and moral landscapes. This episode examines how men formed intimate relationships and partnerships in everyday pre-colonial African life. The evidence emerges from oral histories, indigenous languages, anthropological studies, and, ironically, some of the very colonial-era documents that attempted to condemn or suppress these relationships. By analyzing these sources through a culturally grounded lens, we gain a more accurate understanding of how male-male intimacy operated in African societies prior to colonial disruption. To understand same-sex intimacy among men in pre-colonial Africa, it is important to examine how African societies conceptualized relationships more broadly. In many communities, companionship and emotional closeness between men formed part of age-grade systems, warrior associations, initiation groups, and occupational guilds. Male partnerships often developed within warrior camps, trading networks, craftsman guilds, herding and pastoralist communities, age-grade cohorts, and warrior households. These spaces fostered long-term bonds between men, shaped by daily work, shared responsibilities, and social proximity. In several regions, these bonds included intimate or romantic relationships. Unlike many modern frameworks, pre-colonial African societies did not always define relationships strictly through sexual categories. Instead, relationships were often understood in terms of trust, loyalty, mentorship, companionship, mutual support, household cooperation, and spiritual alignment. In this context, same-sex intimacy did not necessarily challenge gender roles or social expectations. Instead, it existed within accepted cultural norms that differed from later European interpretations. One of the most extensively documented examples of male same-sex partnerships in pre-colonial Africa comes from the Azande people of Central Africa, spread across present-day South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the early 20th century, anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard recorded detailed accounts of Azande warriors who formed marital-like unions with younger male partners. These relationships were integrated into Azande's social structure and governed by recognized customs. The older partner, often a warrior, provided economic support, mentorship, protection, and household resources. The younger partner, sometimes referred to in colonial accounts as a boy wife, contributed to domestic tasks, companionship, and emotional support. These unions were not hidden. They followed established social forms, including gift exchanges and agreements between families. The relationships continued until the older warrior eventually married a woman for lineage purposes, though male partners sometimes remained in the household as respected companions. European observers often viewed these relationships through terms like pederasty, failing to understand the cultural system. Yet Azande oral histories show that these relationships were not marginal or deviant. They were accepted and sometimes encouraged within warrior culture. In the Siwa oasis of Egypt, historical accounts from the 19th century describe formalized unions between men that resembled marriage. These accounts, provided by European travelers, record ceremonies in which men exchanged vows, gifts, or symbolic recognitions of partnership. Siwan men engaged in long-term same-sex relationships that blended emotional companionship, domestic cooperation, and social recognition. These unions occurred alongside heterosexual marriages, and both forms of partnership were understood within local customs. European writers expressed shock at these practices. but their own records inadvertently preserve evidence of how normalized same-sex relationships were in this part of North Africa prior to colonial moral interventions. Along the Swahili coast, stretching from modern-day Mozambique through Tanzania, Kenya, and up to southern Somalia, individuals known as shoga occupied distinct gendered roles that blended masculine and feminine expressions. Shoga men often engaged in intimate relationships with other men, including fishermen, sailors, and traders. These relationships were not hidden and formed part of Swahili urban life. Historical accounts describe shoga individuals as reformers, domestic caretakers, cultural intermediaries, and companions. Swahili oral histories and poetry contain references to relationships between men, indicating that such relationships were part of coastal culture before colonization. These relationships existed alongside Islamic social structures, demonstrating the adaptability of local customs. Colonial administrations later targeted shoga communities, interpreting their roles through imported moral frameworks and imposing social penalties that disrupted established cultural patterns. In northern Nigeria and parts of Niger, the Hausa people maintained long-standing cultural roles for yandaudu, feminine men, who participated in dance, social ceremonies, domestic work, and community entertainment. Yandaudu often formed partnerships with men, including traders, aristocrats, court attendants, and market leaders. These relationships were not constructed as secret or underground. Instead, they were woven into everyday Hausa life, particularly in urban centers. British colonial officials, however, viewed yandaudu and their relationships as incompatible with Victorian morality. As a result, colonial law targeted gender non-conforming individuals and disrupted the social structures that had once supported them. In East Africa, age-grade systems structured social life in numerous communities, including the Maasai, Samburu, Kalenjin, and other Nilotic-speaking groups. Young men often lived together in warrior barracks for extended periods, forming close bonds through shared training, herding responsibilities, and community defense. Ethnographic accounts describe relationships between warriors that were emotionally significant and sometimes included physical intimacy. These relationships existed within age-grade norms and were not viewed as contradictory to later life marriages to women. In pastoralist societies, emotional bonds between men carried deep cultural meaning, expressed through mutual support, shared labor, and companionship over long distances. European observers often misinterpreted these bonds through a sexualized lens, or dismissed them as merely symbolic, failing to recognize the full range of emotional and intimate expression that existed within these relationships. In West Africa, linguistic evidence, oral histories, and cultural practices reveal signs of male same-sex intimacy across various societies. Among the Yoruba, terms such as ajozidi indicate the existence of men who formed intimate partnerships with other men. These relationships often occurred in urban centers and were integrated into market life, artisan guilds, and spiritual practices. In Akan-speaking regions, historical narratives reference male companions who shared domestic life or ritual responsibilities. While less extensively documented, the linguistic and oral evidence suggests that such relationships existed within accepted social parameters. In the Igbo context, although attention is often placed on woman-to-woman marriage systems, there are indications that male companionships existed, particularly in associations tied to trade, ritual practice, or migratory labor. These examples illustrate that male same-sex intimacy in West Africa was not isolated, but part of broader cultural patterns. In many African societies, households did not always adhere to nuclear family structures. Extended families, companion households, multi-generational living, and age-grade housing influenced how relationships developed. In several regions, men who formed strong partnerships with other men sometimes lived together in shared homes. These partnerships could be long-term and socially acknowledged, though not always labeled through the equivalent of modern sexual categories. Such living arrangements provided emotional companionship, economic collaboration, shared domestic work, and social recognition within the community. These partnerships demonstrate that domestic life in pre-colonial Africa allowed for relational flexibility that extended beyond heterosexual frameworks. African languages offer some of the most compelling evidence of same-sex intimacy. Across the continent, pre-colonial vocabulary exists that describes men who loved men, gender non-conforming men, intimate partnerships between men, ritual or ceremonial roles for same-sex companions. Examples include Yoruba, Adazidi, Hausa, Young Daudu, Swahili, Shoga, Amharic, various historical terms for same-sex intimacy, Mande languages, references to male companions in warrior contexts. The presence of such terms predating colonial contact indicates that male same-sex relationships were recognized as part of African social reality. In many African spiritual systems, intimate relationships between men formed part of ritual practice or community responsibility. For example, male-on-male intimacy sometimes accompanied initiation rites, warrior bonding rituals, ancestor veneration roles, spiritual possession ceremonies, and rites emphasizing symbolic kinship. These practices were interpreted within their cultural and ritual contexts, not as breaches of morality. European observers frequently misinterpreted or condemned these practices, describing them through frameworks that did not align with African cosmologies. Colonial rule dramatically altered African interpretations of male same-sex intimacy. European legal codes criminalized same-sex relationships, while missionary doctrines portrayed them as immoral. These systems ignored or deliberately suppressed indigenous traditions and replaced them with Western norms. As a result, public attitude shifted, cultural roles for gender non-conforming men disappeared, same-sex households dissolved under pressure, and historical memory changed. This transformation was not a natural evolution of African culture, but a direct result of colonial intervention. Understanding the history of male same-sex intimacy in Africa helps counter the belief that such relationships are foreign to African culture. These histories demonstrate that male-male intimacy existed in numerous societies. Relationships were structured through cultural norms. Gender and sexuality were interpreted differently before colonization. Queer identity has indigenous African precedents, and colonial narratives distorted these realities. By examining historical evidence with care and cultural sensitivity, we gain a clearer picture of Africa's past, one that includes diverse expressions of masculinity, affection, and partnership. Male same-sex intimacy in pre-colonial Africa was part of everyday life across a wide range of societies. These relationships reflected cultural norms that differed from the frameworks imposed by colonial authorities. They existed within structures of kinship, spirituality, domestic life, and community bonds. Recognizing this history restores a fuller, more accurate understanding of Africa's relationship to gender and sexuality.